Hey, what's going on guys? Welcome back, and in this episode we're finally going to be working on adding enemies. So let's just get straight to it. Alright, so the first thing we need to do is, just like the player we've set up, is we're going to do the same thing. We need a sprite and we need a 3D object to go with that. So we're going to right click, insert a new object, and we're going to do a 3D sprite. Let's give this a name and we'll just call this enemy 1 for now. We can change this later. Next we're going to add a behaviour, and we just want to search Pathfinding. This is what we'll be using to actually target the player and then move towards them. So once you've done this, we're going to head over to the settings in here. And so you can see we've got things like cell size, cell border and stuff like that. So what this does is this creates a grid on the ground, like an invisible grid, and this is going to be what the enemy uses to determine the best path towards the player. So cell size is how big this grid is, so we could set that to something like 64. The smaller you make this size is going to increase the precision, but it's also going to increase the demand on the performance. So keep that in mind. The rest of these settings can all stay the same, except we don't want to be rotating the object. If this is a 2.5D game or something like that, unless you're just going to use 3D shapes, you can keep that. I'm going to be using 2D billboard sprites, so we're going to disable that. We'll keep diagonals working. So on top of this, let's add some variables for down the line. So inside of here, we're going to want the same variables roughly as what we did the player. So we're going to want things like the health, we want to add the damage, and then let's give it an attack cooldown. Lastly, if you're doing the billboard method like I am, you just need to disable all these faces again, other than the bottom face. And then we also just make sure it's on the game layer. Okay, so let's just quickly add the actual image. So we need to insert an object. We're going to add a sprite. Okay, and then for now I've got one of these assets I created in the past. I'm just going to use this like tomato character thing. The whole theme, by the time I finish this, we're just going to have a chef and he's going to be having a bunch of, like vegetables and things chasing him. Okay, so once you've added your texture and you're happy with that, we just need to attach it to the enemy. So just scroll down to the bottom and then bottom face object and just select the texture. Like this. And as you can see, we've now got an enemy. Alright guys, so just real quick, I've just quickly dragged all these to the left and I've just placed them inside of a box, so it's just a sprite, and I've just given it a solid behaviour. This is just for now, so sometimes it requires you to have an instance in the page, right? So let's say we have these characters here. This is also just to prevent them, just in case there's an off chance that they'll start, trying to attack the player from outside this page. Okay, then one more thing we need to create before we head to the event sheet is we need to insert a new sprite, and this is going to be the spawner, so we can just give this a square or something. And we can just, put an S on it or something like this. So we know this is the spawner, and we can just call this enemy spawner. Okay, I'm just going to select and just drag this out a few times. Okay, great, so once you've done this, let's head over to the event sheet. Alright guys, let's add a group. We're going to right click, add a group. Call this enemies. Okay, then right click, and we're going to add a subgroup. And we'll call this Pathfinding. So this is just because we're going to have, obviously you're going to have multiple events for your enemies, so this is just a good way to just keep your, your movement separate. And then so what we're going to do is we're going to be creating a loop where every so many seconds we're going to iterate through all the different enemies and re-update that pathfinding. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to add an event, and then we're going to go system, and then instead of every tick, we're going to be saying every X seconds, and let's just set this to 0.3. This is just because every tick is going to be too demanding for something like this. So right click this. We're going to add another condition, and we're going to say system for each, and then we're to set the enemy. So we have here enemy tomato, or what you named it, enemy 1. I'll just quickly mention, so if you do have the paid version, just like I mentioned in the previous episode, I would use families here, and so I would create a family, and I would call it enemies, put all your enemies inside of there, and then instead of having to create different loops for each enemy type, you can just reference that one family. Alright, so anyways, what we're going to do is we're going to add an action. We're going to say enemy pathfinding, we want to find path, and so here now what we want to do is we want to find the position of the player. Alright, then inside of here, all we have to do is we can just say player billboard dot x, and then for the y we can just do the same thing, dot y. Now you could leave this at this and it will, lock onto player. However, I've noticed that, so if you do this, you get a weird, the enemies will all go to the exact same place or start clipping with each other. So what we could do is we could just add a plus random, and then do brackets, and then inside of here we want to have two values, so we could say like minus 128 to 128, and all this is doing is, so this is just, so it's instead of directly locking onto the player, it's going to be picking a random position around that player, so just every enemy then will have a slight different, position, and then just copy this and paste it in the Y. Okay, good, so now when we find the path, we now have to tell it what to do once it's found the path. So we can another event, and we could say enemy on path found, and then we want to actually make it go towards the player, right? So all we need to do is we just say enemy, and we just want to say move along path. Alright, great. So every 0.3 seconds, we're iterating through each enemy instance, and then we're finding the player's position on the path. And then once we've found that, we're then going to move along that path. Okay, so for now we could just quickly test this if you just paste in a couple of your enemies, and then we can just preview this. Okay, great. So as you can see, we hit play, and the enemies all now are locking onto the player and moving towards it. Alright, great. So let's just quickly set up the damage. So what we can do is select your enemy, and we'll set this to something like, we'll set it to 25 maybe. And so that now deals 25. Head back over to your event sheet, and then we're going to add a new event, and we're going to say enemy on collision with, and then player billboard. So on collision with the player billboard, and then we already have this up here, so we can just kind of use this, and then we can subtract from their health, and then we can subtract the enemy tomato dot damage. So every time the enemy hits the player, we're subtracting the enemy damage. Okay, great. So this method will work. However, we can improve this where we can then start using the attack cooldown. So we can disable this for now, or you can use that if you just want it, if you want in a simple example. So to use the actual cooldown, what we can do is, so first let's set the cooldown, and we can say maybe every 3 seconds. And then what we'll do is we'll say system, type in every, and then what we're going to do is, so instead of every X seconds, so you can click that, but what we can do is instead we can type in here the variable, so we can say enemy tomato dot attack cooldown. So now what this means, so then every 3 seconds, we can then trigger the damage. We want to right click, add a blank sub event, and then inside here we just want to add a check to see if it's actually colliding with the player. So we say enemy tomato is overlapping another object, player billboard, and so now what this does is, so this will only trigger every 3 seconds, but if they are overlapping the player, then we can use this damage function here. And then we can also copy this up here, and we can set the width of the health bar like we did in the previous video. So that's the basics for damage there. Okay, great. Now, so now when the enemies hit the player, every 3 seconds, they'll now start taking damage. Alright guys, so lastly, let's get the enemy spawning system set up. This is a simplified version of what we're going to be creating in the future, where we'll be, creating a wave system and things like that. For now, what we can do is let's insert a new global variable. We'll call this enemy count. And for now, this is going to represent how many enemies should be spawned. We'll set this to 10. So when we start the game, there should be 10 enemies. Let's right click on the enemies folder. We're going to add, and let's add a new group. And we'll just call this spawning logic. We're going to add an event. We're going to say system, so we'll add another on start of layout. Add a blank event. And then we're going to system again. And we're going to repeat this. So we're going to select repeat. And want to repeat this the number of times of the variable. Alternatively, you could just manually set this to 10, but it's good. It's good to use variables. So then we'll say enemy count. So on the start of the layout, repeat 10 times, and then what we want to do is we also want to add a check here. So we want to add another sub event. We want to say system, pick random instance. We want to set the spawner, and so now, every time it repeats, it's going to pick a random instance of the spawner, which is why we created 4 of these images before. And then what we do is say add system, create object, and then we're going to create the tomato of whatever you've called your enemy. Put on the game layer, and then for the X and Y, we just want to set this to the actual, the spawn point. So we say enemy spawner dot X. We'll set this to enemy spawner dot Y. And then just like before, we can add a random, so we could say plus, random, brackets, and then we can say minus 100 to 100, something like that. Same thing here, we can just copy and paste this. And so now if we test this, 10 enemies should be spawned, and they're going to be distributed between the different random points. Alright guys, as you can see, it's now spawned 10 enemies, and it picks random instances of the spawn point. They'll follow the player, and then when they do, deal damage. Alright guys, so I'm going to leave it here. That's the basics of, setting up enemy spawnings, pathfinding, and stuff like that. So yeah, we're gonna build on this in the future. But I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care guys.